What if the most dangerous person in the room was never the stranger at the gate? What if the real threat was already inside the house, sleeping just feet away, sharing meals, laughing at the table, passing every family photo like nothing was wrong? And what if the warning signs were there the entire time, but no one wanted to see them? Because tonight's story doesn't begin with blood. It begins with silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The kind of silence that settles over a wealthy neighborhood when the sun goes down and nothing feels out of place, until suddenly, everything is. A sprawling estate in the hills. Gated, private, secure. The kind of place people assume is immune from the horrors that only happen to other families. But behind those walls, something had been unraveling for years. And when authorities finally stepped inside, what they uncovered would raise questions that still don't have answers. Questions about power, control, family loyalty, fear, and the terrifying moment when a mother realizes the person she raised may no longer be someone she recognizes. Let me ask you something. How well do you really know the people you love? Because investigators now believe this case wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. They believe it was the final chapter of a long, hidden story. One filled with warning signs that were ignored, minimized, or buried under money, influence, and denial. And tonight, we're walking through that story step by step. Not rumors, not internet noise, but the timeline investigators are piecing together behind closed doors. And once you see the full picture, you'll understand why federal authorities quietly stepped in. It was late on a Sunday night when emergency calls began flooding in from one of the most exclusive streets in the city. No screams, no chaos reported, just a panicked voice saying something was wrong. Very wrong. When first responders arrived, they weren't prepared for what they found. Two victims, a married couple, both elderly, both well-known in their circles, both discovered inside their own home. And the details immediately told detectives one chilling truth. This wasn't a break-in. Nothing was stolen. No forced entry. No sign of a struggle near the doors. Whoever did this didn't need to break in. They already belonged there. And that realization narrowed the suspect pool instantly. Because only a handful of people had unrestricted access to the property. Only a handful of people knew the layout of the house. The routines. The blind spots. The times when security systems were relaxed. And only one person lived on the property full-time. Just steps away from the main residence. A family member. Someone police would later describe as deeply troubled long before that night ever arrived. But here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because investigators aren't just looking at what happened that night. They're looking at what happened months earlier. Years earlier. Moments that were brushed off as family issues. Incidents quietly handled behind closed doors. Conversations that were never documented. And claims that, if proven, suggest the violence didn't begin with weapons. It began with control. According to sources close to the investigation, authorities are examining allegations that the household had been living under increasing tension. Not loud arguments, not public meltdowns, but something more unsettling. A pattern of fear, a pattern of emotional pressure, and a growing sense that boundaries inside the home were being tested and crossed. Now, before we go any further, I want to be very clear. Nothing you're about to hear has been publicly proven in court. These are allegations under investigation, reconstructed through interviews, digital evidence, and witness statements. But taken together, they paint a picture that's hard to ignore. And it starts with a mother who, according to those closest to her, began changing. Friends noticed she was quieter, more cautious, more withdrawn. She stopped hosting gatherings the way she used to. She canceled plans unexpectedly. And when asked why, she'd smile and say everything was fine. But those who knew her best say that smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. Why? Because behind closed doors, the dynamic inside the home had shifted. The balance of authority, the sense of safety, the unspoken rules that keep families functioning. Something was off. And when investigators interviewed family members after the incident, one statement kept resurfacing again and again. There was fear in that house. Fear doesn't just appear overnight. It grows, quietly, like a crack in a foundation no one wants to acknowledge. And authorities now believe that fear may have reached a breaking point in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Here's the part that makes this case especially disturbing. Detectives aren't just examining violence. They're examining behavior, text messages, emails, deleted notes, patterns of isolation, and allegations that suggest attempts at exerting inappropriate control within the household. Not acts described in graphic detail, but actions that, if substantiated, point to a profound violation of trust. And when those allegations were allegedly resisted, that resistance may have triggered something far darker. Think about that for a moment. What happens when control is challenged? What happens when someone who believes they're entitled to power suddenly loses it? Investigators believe the answer to that question may be the key to understanding what unfolded next. But here's where the timeline becomes especially chilling. Because on the day of the incident, everything appeared normal. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. No shouting, no disturbances, no obvious signs of conflict. Which raises an unsettling question. Was the violence planned? Or was it the result of a confrontation that spiraled beyond anyone's control? That's what authorities are still trying to determine. And it's why federal agencies quietly began assisting. Not because of celebrity, not because of money, but because of the complexity, the psychological layers, the possibility that this wasn't just a crime of passion, but the end result of something that had been building for a very long time. And then there's the witness who changed everything. The family member who discovered the scene. The one who immediately told police there was someone they needed to look at. Someone dangerous. Someone they believed posed a threat long before that night. Imagine making that call. Imagine realizing the truth might be worse than anything you ever feared. And imagine knowing that once you speak, nothing will ever be the same again. Because that statement didn't just direct investigators. It cracked the family narrative wide open. Suddenly, this wasn't a tragedy with no explanation. It was a story with history, a story with secrets, a story where loyalty collided with survival. And the deeper investigators dig, the more one unsettling theme keeps emerging. This wasn't just about violence. It was about power. And when power was finally challenged, everything collapsed. But what investigators uncovered next, hidden in digital records, private conversations, and overlooked warning signs, would change the direction of the case entirely. And once those details surfaced, there was no turning back. Because the question was no longer who did this. The question became, why didn't anyone stop it sooner? And what else had been happening inside that house that no one outside ever saw? Because what came next would force authorities to re-examine everything they thought they knew. And the truth, when it finally began to surface, was far more disturbing than anyone expected. But to understand how it all led here, we have to go back to the years before the house fell silent, back to the moment the first boundary was crossed, and back to the warning sign that, if taken seriously, might have changed everything. What if the first warning sign wasn't violent? What if it didn't look like danger at all? What if it looked like concern, mixed with love, mixed with denial? Because when investigators began reconstructing the early years of this family dynamic, one thing became painfully clear. No one wakes up one morning inside a nightmare. They walk into it slowly, step by step. And in the beginning, everything still looked normal. The house was impressive, but not cold. Lived in, comfortable, full of personal touches that suggested stability. Family photos on the walls. Holiday decorations stored carefully in labeled boxes. A kitchen that still smelled like home-cooked meals. From the outside, this was a family that had made it. Success, longevity, respect. And at the center of it all were two parents who, by most accounts, had built a life around protecting their children, especially one of them. Because from an early age, there were concerns. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that trigger alarms, but small things. Mood swings that were explained away as stress. Outbursts that were blamed on pressure. Moments of withdrawal followed by bursts of charm. Does that sound familiar? It's the kind of pattern people rationalize. The kind that families quietly adapt around. Because it's easier to adjust than confront. And that's exactly what seemed to happen here. Friends recall the parents often excusing behavior with phrases like, "He's just misunderstood. He's been through a lot. He doesn't mean it that way." Each explanation felt reasonable, on its own. But over time, those explanations began stacking up. And when explanations pile up, something else is usually happening underneath. According to individuals who later spoke with investigators, There was a shift sometime after the adult child moved into the guest house on the property. At first, it was framed as support, a safe place to regroup, a temporary arrangement. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one sets boundaries. And boundaries, investigators now believe, were the first thing to erode. It started subtly. Requests that weren't really requests. Expectations that weren't openly stated. An assumption that access was guaranteed. Space, privacy, autonomy, things most adults take for granted, became blurry inside that household. And here's the contradiction that makes this case so difficult to unpack. The parents were deeply loving. But love, when mixed with fear, can become dangerous. Because fear doesn't always look like terror. Sometimes it looks like walking on eggshells. Sometimes it looks like choosing silence. Sometimes it looks like changing your behavior to avoid triggering someone else. And slowly, people began noticing changes. The mother, once outspoken, became cautious. She started deferring decisions she used to make confidently. She avoided being alone in certain areas of the house. She made excuses to leave rooms early. Little things. But when investigators later laid those moments out chronologically, they stopped looking little. They started looking deliberate, almost defensive. And then there were the conversations that never made it outside the family. Private discussions about discomfort, about things that didn't feel right, about a growing sense that boundaries were being pushed. Not violently, not loudly, but persistently. Here's the question investigators are now asking. What happens when someone inside a family begins testing limits and realizes no one is stopping them? Because once that realization hits, behavior can escalate. And according to sources close to the case, escalation is exactly what they believe happened. But not all at once. There were pauses, moments where it seemed like things might improve. Apologies, promises, calm periods that made everyone hope the worst was over. Hope is powerful. It convinces people to ignore patterns. And patterns are what investigators look for first. One of the most revealing parts of the investigation wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a routine day, a day where nothing bad happened. Because on that day, a friend reportedly noticed something off. A look, a tension, a hesitation before answering a simple question. And when that friend later replayed the moment in their head, they realized the mother had been scanning the room before speaking, as if checking who could hear. Why would someone do that in their own home? That question alone caused investigators to lean in. Because fear doesn't need bruises to be real. It leaves other traces, changes in routines, altered communication, isolation. And one of the most significant shifts came when the family began pulling away from others. Less socializing, fewer visitors, more privacy. Privacy that, in hindsight, may have protected the wrong person. Now, here's where the timeline becomes especially important. Because while the household was becoming quieter on the outside, internal tensions were rising. Text messages became shorter. Tone shifted. The warmth disappeared. And investigators believe that behind those messages were conflicts that never reached public view. Conflicts over control, over autonomy, over who had authority inside that space. Imagine the pressure. Living with someone who feels entitled to your time, your attention, your emotional energy. Someone who doesn't respect no. Not because they're openly aggressive, but because they don't believe it applies to them. That's the behavior pattern investigators are examining. And when they interviewed people close to the family, a disturbing phrase kept appearing. He made her uncomfortable. Not once, not twice, enough times to stand out. And yet, nothing was done. Why? Because families often protect their own. Because confronting the truth can feel more terrifying than living with it. Because acknowledging danger means admitting failure. And because love makes people believe they can fix things that are already breaking. But then came the moment investigators now describe as a turning point. A moment when resistance appeared. A moment when boundaries were reasserted. And according to the working theory, that moment didn't go over well. Because control, once challenged, doesn't always retreat quietly. Sometimes it pushes back. Hard. And while no one outside the house heard that confrontation, its aftermath may have been felt. Tension thickened. The emotional atmosphere shifted. People avoided eye contact. Conversations became clipped. And behind closed doors, something fractured. Here's what makes this especially chilling. Authorities believe that by this point, the family was no longer dealing with misunderstandings. They were dealing with a power struggle. One side attempting to reclaim autonomy. the other refusing to relinquish control. And in situations like that, outcomes are rarely peaceful. But no one imagined where this was headed. Because despite everything, the parents still believed in reconciliation, still believed in patience, still believed things could be repaired. And that belief may have bought time, but it may have also allowed danger to grow, unchecked, unmonitored, until the final days arrived. And when investigators reconstruct those last weeks, they don't see chaos. They see calm, a deceptive calm, the kind that settles before a storm. No screaming matches reported, no dramatic scenes witnessed, just a quiet household where everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Waiting. For what? That's the question authorities are still trying to answer. Because when the night finally came, there was no warning siren. No neighbors calling in noise complaints. No obvious trigger that anyone could point to afterward. Which suggests the breaking point didn't happen suddenly. It had already happened internally, long before. And the events of that night may have been the release of something that had been building for years. But before we get there, before we talk about that final evening, we need to examine the warning signs that came just days earlier. The ones that almost slipped through the cracks. The messages that felt off. The behavior that, in hindsight, looks like a countdown. Because investigators believe the last chance to intervene came right before everything collapsed. And when we look at what happened next, it raises the most haunting question of all. Did someone know this was coming and feel powerless to stop it? Because the final days reveal details that change how this entire story is understood. And once you see those details, you'll understand why authorities believe the tragedy was no accident, but something far more preventable. Have you ever noticed how silence can feel louder than shouting? Because in the final weeks before everything collapsed, the house didn't erupt into chaos. It went quiet, too quiet. And that, investigators now believe, was the most dangerous phase of all. By this point, the dynamic inside the home had shifted again, but not toward healing, toward restraint, careful movements, careful words, careful timing. Everyone inside that house seemed to be adjusting their behavior around one person. And when that happens, something fundamental has already gone wrong. Let's rewind to those final weeks. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. The neighborhood remained calm. The gates opened and closed on schedule. Lights turned on and off at familiar hours. But internally, the emotional temperature was changing. According to people who later spoke with investigators, the parents began limiting interactions. Shorter conversations, less eye contact. They avoided shared spaces unless necessary. Meals were no longer communal. Does that sound like peace to you? Or does it sound like survival? Because to trained investigators, those are classic signs of avoidance. And avoidance usually follows fear. One of the most striking details uncovered during the investigation wasn't a dramatic argument. It was a pattern of separation. Separate schedules, separate routines, separate emotional worlds under the same roof. The mother, in particular, began structuring her day differently. She ran errands at odd hours. She stayed on phone calls longer than usual. She lingered in public places instead of returning home quickly. Why would someone do that? Ask yourself. If home feels safe, you rush back to it. If it doesn't, you delay. Investigators believe this was not coincidence. They believe it was instinct. And instincts don't lie. Another key detail emerged from digital records. Messages that grew colder. Replies that became delayed. Language that shifted from warmth to formality. Instead of full sentences, there were fragments. Instead of reassurance, there was distance. And then there were the unsent messages. Drafts. Notes never transmitted. Words typed, then erased. Investigators often say unsent messages tell you more than sent ones, because they show what someone was afraid to say. And fear, once again, is the thread weaving through this case. Now, here's where things take a darker turn. According to sources familiar with the investigation, there were allegations, still being examined, that the mother had explicitly reasserted boundaries during this period. Clear ones, firm ones, boundaries that left no room for negotiation. And for the first time, those boundaries were reportedly backed by consequences. Access restricted, interactions limited, control challenged. That moment matters, because in cases involving control dynamics, when we look at the night itself, the sequence of events becomes even more chilling, and the details uncovered there would solidify this case as something far darker than anyone initially imagined. Because once investigators reconstructed those final hours, they realized the house wasn't just quiet. It was holding its breath. And what happened next would permanently redefine this family's legacy. What really happens in the final hours before a life shatters? Is it chaos? Is it rage? Or is it something far more unsettling, control? Because when investigators reconstructed the night everything broke, they didn't find a scene that screamed madness. They found a sequence, a progression, a night that unfolded with disturbing intention. And once that realization set in, the entire case took on a different weight. Let's go back to that evening. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place. No flashing lights. No raised voices reported. No neighbors calling in complaints. The street remained quiet, the way it always had. And that's the first thing investigators found chilling. Because violent crimes that erupt suddenly tend to leave noise behind. This one didn't, which suggests something else entirely. According to the working timeline, the household followed a familiar rhythm that night. Lights on, doors locked, televisions flickering in separate rooms. Everyone where they were expected to be, until they weren't. Investigators believe the final confrontation did not begin with violence. It began with proximity. Two people in the same space. A conversation that, on the surface, may have appeared ordinary. But beneath that surface, pressure. Tension that had been building for weeks. Possibly years. And here's where the psychological picture becomes critical. Because control dynamics don't explode immediately. They test. They push. They wait for resistance. And when resistance appears, real resistance, it can provoke a dangerous response. Authorities believe that night marked a turning point, a moment when it became clear that boundaries were no longer flexible, that autonomy was being reclaimed. And for someone who equates control with identity, that realization can feel like an existential threat. Imagine being told, implicitly or explicitly, that your access is ending, that your influence is diminishing, that your presence is no longer welcome in the way it once was. Now imagine hearing that from the person who has always represented stability, security, authority. That's not just rejection. That's collapse. Investigators believe that realization may have triggered a rapid escalation, but not in a loud, cinematic way, in a quiet one. The kind that happens when a decision is made internally, a decision that doesn't announce itself. It simply moves forward. One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is how contained everything appears to have been. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle throughout the house. No evidence of chaos spilling from room to room, which suggests the encounter was controlled, focused, and deeply personal. This wasn't about destruction. It was about dominance. And once violence began, investigators believe it unfolded quickly, not impulsively, but decisively. That distinction matters. Because impulsive acts often leave behind confusion. This scene did not. It left behind finality. When authorities arrived later, the absence of disruption stood out. Furniture undisturbed. Valuables untouched. No sign of an intruder. Everything pointed inward, toward someone who knew the space, knew the routines, knew where people would be, and most importantly, knew how to move through the house unnoticed. Now let's talk about time. Because time is one of the most revealing elements of this night. Investigators believe there was a window, brief but critical, between the initial act and the moment the house went completely silent. A window where something could have happened. A call, a decision, an interruption, but nothing came. And that raises a question investigators are still wrestling with. Was there hesitation? Or was there resolve? Because the actions that followed suggest neither panic nor regret. They suggest continuation, which implies something even more disturbing, that the violence wasn't accidental. It was sequential. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. Think about that. The psychological threshold involved in harming one person and then proceeding further. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when internal restraints have already collapsed. And according to behavioral analysts involved in the case, those restraints may have eroded long before that night. This wasn't the start. It was the end. Now here's where the timeline becomes even more chilling. Because after everything occurred, the house didn't erupt into movement. It didn't fill with frantic activity. It went still. Lights remained on in some areas. Off in others. Doors stayed closed. Which suggests whoever remained inside was not acting in panic. They weren't scrambling to escape. They weren't seeking help. They were waiting. Waiting for what? That's one of the most haunting questions of the entire case. Because waiting implies expectation, and expectation implies forethought. Investigators have examined whether there was an attempt to clean, conceal, or alter the scene. What they found was minimal, almost non-existent, which again suggests this wasn't about hiding what happened. It was about completing something. And that psychological detail has become central to how authorities view the case. Now let's talk about discovery. Because discovery is where the story shifts from private tragedy to public reckoning. The family member who entered the house did not expect what they found. No one ever does. But what's striking is how quickly they understood the nature of the situation. There was no confusion, no disbelief, just recognition, as if some part of them had feared this outcome already. Imagine walking into a space that once felt safe and instantly knowing it never will again. Imagine the shock of realization colliding with grief. And imagine knowing, almost immediately, who investigators needed to speak to. That's what makes the initial statement so powerful. Because it wasn't speculative. It wasn't hesitant. It was urgent. A warning. This person is dangerous. That phrase changed everything. It reframed the scene, reframed the investigation, and forced authorities to confront the possibility that this tragedy was anticipated, at least by someone. And once that door opened, the case accelerated rapidly. Officers began separating family narratives, comparing timelines, cross-checking statements. And the more they dug, the clearer it became that the night's events were not isolated. They were connected to a much larger pattern, one of escalation, one of entitlement, one of boundaries crossed and recrossed until resistance finally appeared. But here's the part that continues to trouble investigators. There were no emergency calls from inside the house, no last-minute pleas, no attempts to flee, which suggests the moment of danger may have come suddenly. And that possibility raises another chilling thought. Was there an attempt to reason? To de-escalate? To calm someone who had already decided? Because in many cases like this, there's a brief moment, seconds, where outcomes can still change. And investigators are haunted by the idea that such a moment may have existed here, but passed unnoticed, or unheard. By the time authorities secured the scene, the story was already written. But not understood. Because what happened next would add another layer of complexity to the case. The behavior after the incident, the demeanor, the responses, the absence of visible emotion where emotion might be expected. Investigators don't rely on gut feelings. They rely on patterns. And the post-incident behavior raised red flags. Not because it was explosive, but because it was flat, detached, as if something had already shut down internally. That kind of emotional state often indicates dissociation or relief. Neither is reassuring. And when authorities placed the primary suspect into custody, they didn't just begin asking questions about that night. They began asking questions about the years before it. Because by then, it was clear. The night didn't create the monster. It revealed it. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because as investigators continued combing through evidence, they uncovered materials that suggested the control dynamics extended further than anyone had realized. Messages, statements, behaviors that reframed the relationship entirely. And once those details emerged, federal authorities took a closer interest. Not because of who the family was, but because of what the case represented. A textbook example of how unchecked control inside families can escalate into irreversible tragedy. And as the investigation expanded, one realization began to settle in. This case wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that led up to it, and everything that was missed along the way. Because when we look at the evidence authorities uncovered next, we begin to see how long this outcome may have been forming, and why the warning signs, once assembled, paint a picture that's impossible to ignore. But the most disturbing revelations were still to come. Because buried within digital records and private communications were clues investigators believe explain the final decision. Clues that suggest the night everything broke wasn't spontaneous. It was inevitable. And once you understand what investigators found next, you'll see why this case has shaken even seasoned professionals. Because the truth doesn't just implicate one person. It implicates silence, and the cost of ignoring it. What if the truth wasn't hidden, just overlooked? Because after the arrest, when the headlines faded and the house was sealed, investigators did what they always do next. They went looking for patterns. not motives, not confessions, patterns. And what they uncovered didn't just support the timeline. It rewrote it. The first thing authorities focused on wasn't the crime scene anymore. It was the past. Devices were cataloged. Phones, laptops, tablets, old backups people forget even exist. And with each layer uncovered, a new question emerged. Why hadn't anyone noticed this sooner? The digital trail didn't explode with obvious red flags. It whispered. Short messages, deleted drafts, unsent notes, fragments of thoughts saved and erased repeatedly. That kind of digital behavior immediately caught analysts' attention. Because people don't repeatedly write and delete the same message unless they're afraid of how it will be received, or who might see it. Investigators found evidence of repeated attempts to articulate discomfort. Not accusations, not dramatic declarations, just careful wording, soft language, language that tried not to provoke. Why would someone need to be careful in their own home? That question sits at the center of this chapter. As analysts reconstructed message timelines, something became clear. Communication shifted long before the final weeks. Months earlier, the tone changed from familial warmth to logistical necessity. From "how are you" to "what time?" From connection to coordination. That shift matters, because it often signals emotional withdrawal, a quiet boundary being constructed. But here's where the contradictions begin. At the same time communication cooled, proximity increased. Shared spaces, unscheduled encounters, unavoidable overlap. That combination, distance mixed with forced closeness, is combustible. It breeds tension, and tension, when unresolved, looks for release. Another discovery deepened investigators' concern. Search histories, not violent ones, not explicit ones, but searches related to control, authority, entitlement, psychological language, terms associated with dominance and perceived injustice. That alone doesn't prove intent, but paired with everything else, it added weight. Then came the calendar data. Events added, then removed. Plans postponed indefinitely. Appointments canceled. Trips delayed. Investigators noted that future plans seemed to collapse inward. The horizon shortened. Life became smaller. And shrinking futures often signal distress. But the most unsettling discovery came from something far less obvious. Behavioral logs. Smart home systems quietly record everything. Door access times, light usage, motion patterns. And when analysts overlaid those logs with communication data, a pattern emerged. One person's movements increased as others decreased. Late-night activity rose. Private spaces were entered more frequently. Shared areas were avoided by others. That pattern doesn't appear in healthy households. It appears in environments where someone is asserting presence, claiming space, pushing limits. Investigators then began interviewing people who had brushed against the family's orbit. Staff, friends, casual acquaintances. And without prompting, similar descriptions surfaced. He lingered. He didn't take hints. She seemed uncomfortable but polite. Things felt off, but no one said anything. That last phrase matters. No one said anything. Because discomfort doesn't always look like danger. Until it does. Now, here's where the evidence became impossible to ignore. Analysts uncovered a series of notes, private, personal, never sent. They weren't accusations. They were reflections. Attempts to rationalize behavior. Attempts to set boundaries in writing. And attempts to convince oneself that unease was temporary. That things would improve. That this was just a phase. That self-persuasion is heartbreaking. Because it shows someone trying to survive emotionally while minimizing their own fear. Investigators believe those notes may have been written after particularly tense interactions. Moments when something crossed a line, but not a visible one. And that's important, because lines don't have to be loud to be crossed. Sometimes they're crossed quietly, repeatedly, until resistance finally appears. The next discovery shifted the investigation further. Audio logs, not recordings. Metadata. Voice assistant interactions. Short commands. Late hours. Requests repeated multiple times. That repetition suggests agitation, restlessness, inability to settle. And when those timestamps were aligned with movement data, a troubling rhythm emerged. Wakefulness, pacing, revisiting the same areas. Over and over. It looked less like insomnia, more like obsession. At this point, federal consultants were brought in, not because of status, but because the psychological profile was becoming complex. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute. This was a layered dynamic involving control, entitlement, and erosion of boundaries over time. Consultants flagged a key risk factor: perceived loss. When someone who relies on control senses it slipping away, the risk of escalation increases dramatically. And that perception doesn't require reality. It only requires belief. Investigators believe that belief solidified shortly before the incident. Because right before everything ended, there was a final shift. Communication stopped. Completely. No texts. No calls. No attempts to negotiate. Silence. And silence, in behavioral analysis, often indicates resolution. A decision made. A path chosen. Now let's talk about the aftermath. Because post-incident behavior can be as revealing as pre-incident patterns. When questioned, responses were minimal. Not defensive. Not emotional. Just flat. Detached. Investigators noted the absence of shock. Absence of confusion. Instead, there was compliance without curiosity, as if the outcome had already been processed internally. That doesn't prove anything on its own, but in context, it raised alarms. Another detail stood out. There were no attempts to redirect blame. No alternative narratives offered. Just silence. And silence can mean many things. But in this case, investigators believe it may have reflected something chilling. Acceptance. As the evidence mounted, a realization took hold among the investigative team. This wasn't about one night. It was about a long-term collapse of boundaries that went unchallenged. Unchecked behavior normalized. Discomfort dismissed. Fear minimized. Until the cost became irreversible. And that realization sparked a difficult internal conversation. Not just about responsibility, but about prevention. Because cases like this don't happen in isolation. They follow a script. One society doesn't like to read, but must. And that's why this case has resonated so deeply with professionals. Because it forces a question we rarely ask honestly. How many warning signs do we ignore because acknowledging them would be inconvenient? How many times do we tell ourselves it's not that bad because admitting fear feels like betrayal? And how many tragedies could be prevented if discomfort were taken seriously? But before investigators could answer those questions publicly, another development occurred. One that shifted the legal strategy entirely. Because new evidence didn't just reinforce the timeline. It reframed intent. And once that evidence entered the picture, there was no turning back. Charges hardened. Language sharpened. And the case moved from investigation to prosecution with a gravity that stunned even seasoned attorneys. But the most unsettling part? The realization that the outcome might have been predicted. Not because anyone wanted it to happen, but because the signs were there, all along. And when we move into the next chapter, we'll examine the moment those signs finally converged into a single, unavoidable conclusion. The moment authorities stopped asking what happened and started asking how it was allowed to go on for so long. Because what came next didn't just impact one family. It sent a warning. One that still echoes far beyond that house. What if the most dangerous warning sign isn't anger? What if it's certainty? Because as investigators moved deeper into this case, one realization began to unsettle even the most experienced professionals involved. This wasn't chaos. It was conviction. And conviction, when fused with entitlement, can be lethal. By the time analysts began constructing a psychological profile, the question was no longer whether something snapped. The question was when the internal decision had already been made. Profiles aren't about labels. They're about patterns. And the pattern here pointed towards something deeply disturbing, not because it was explosive, but because it was controlled, measured, deliberate. Investigators noticed early on that emotional expression, at least outwardly, had always been limited. Not absent, but regulated. Anger didn't erupt. It simmered. Disappointment didn't explode. It calcified. And when emotions calcify, they don't dissipate. They harden. Experts call this emotional rigidity, a state where feelings are no longer processed. They're stored. And stored emotions don't fade. They accumulate. One of the first traits analysts flagged was entitlement. Not entitlement to things, but entitlement to people, time, attention, access, control over others' choices. This is an important distinction, because entitlement to people doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks wounded. Sometimes it looks like after everything. That belief can be more dangerous than anger. Because it delays intervention. It convinces everyone that nothing urgent is happening, until it is. Investigators also noted something else. A tendency to externalize blame. Responsibility for emotional discomfort was placed elsewhere. On others' behavior, others' decisions, others' refusal to comply. That externalization meant there was no internal check. No self-questioning. No recalibration. And without self-questioning, behavior doesn't self-correct. It escalates. Another critical trait emerged during analysis. Fixation. Not obsession in the cinematic sense, but a narrowing of focus. Life began orbiting a single emotional axis. Control. Access. Validation. Other interests faded. Social circles shrank. Purpose condensed. When that happens, losing the object of fixation can feel like losing identity itself. And losing identity is intolerable to someone who relies on external validation. Investigators believe that by the final weeks, this fixation had intensified. Signals of withdrawal from others, increased monitoring of routines, heightened sensitivity to perceived slights. Every change in behavior was interpreted as intentional, hostile, provocative. And here's where the profile takes its most dangerous turn. Experts identified what they call grievance accumulation. Small perceived wrongs stored and replayed, each one reinforcing a narrative of injustice. I'm being pushed out. I'm being disrespected. I'm being replaced. That narrative doesn't just justify resentment. It rationalizes retaliation. Because if someone believes they're responding to injustice, violence can feel righteous, necessary, even corrective. Now let's talk about the warning signs that are hardest to see. Not threats, not violence, but language. Language that subtly reframes reality. Phrases that imply inevitability. Finality. Language that suggests outcomes rather than possibilities. Investigators noted shifts in phrasing. From conditional to declarative. From if to when. That change signals a closed mental loop. A decision that has already solidified internally. And once that happens, external input loses influence. No amount of reasoning can penetrate a sealed narrative. This is why late intervention often fails. Because by the time danger is visible, the decision has already been made. Experts also flagged emotional detachment. Not apathy, detachment, a calm that feels artificial, as if emotions have been turned down, not resolved. That state often precedes violent acts, because it allows action without internal resistance. Guilt doesn't interfere. Fear doesn't slow things down. There is only execution. Investigators believe this detachment was present in the final days, not visible to everyone, but detectable in patterns, in behavior, in absence of hesitation. And then there's the most chilling aspect of the profile. Perceived inevitability. The belief that outcomes are predetermined, that events must unfold a certain way. When someone believes this, they no longer feel responsible. They feel like an instrument, a force carrying out what was always going to happen. That belief is incredibly dangerous because it strips away moral brakes. And once moral brakes are gone, nothing stops momentum. What's haunting about this case is how familiar the pattern is. Experts have seen it before, not in every detail, but in structure, in progression, in escalation, which means this wasn't unpredictable. It was overlooked, minimized, explained away. And that realization has shaken investigators deeply because it suggests prevention was possible, not guaranteed, but possible, if discomfort had been taken seriously, if boundaries had been enforced earlier, if fear had been treated as data, not drama. And this is where the story stops being just about one family. It becomes a warning, because these dynamics exist everywhere. In homes, in workplaces, in relationships where control masquerades as care. And the most dangerous moment isn't the explosion. It's the calm certainty that comes before it. But the story doesn't end with psychology. Because once the profile was complete, prosecutors adjusted their strategy. They stopped focusing solely on actions. They focused on intent. And intent changes everything. Because intent transforms tragedy into accountability. And when we move into the next chapter, we'll examine how that psychological profile reshaped the legal case, how charges evolved, how language sharpened, and why prosecutors believe this wasn't just a crime, but the foreseeable outcome of a long-ignored pattern. Because what happens next is where theory meets consequence, and where silence finally loses its power. What changes when a case stops being about actions and starts being about intention? Everything. Because once prosecutors absorbed the psychological profile investigators had assembled, they stopped asking the same questions they'd asked at the beginning. They no longer asked, "What happened that night?" They asked, "Why was this outcome becoming inevitable long before that night arrived?" And that shift changed the entire direction of the case. Up until this point, the evidence had painted a disturbing picture, but one that could still be argued as circumstantial. Patterns, behavior, escalation. But prosecutors knew something critical. Juries don't just need to see that something happened. They need to understand why it couldn't have happened any other way. So they went back, not to the crime scene, to the story that had been unfolding quietly for years. And they began rebuilding the case from the inside out. The first thing prosecutors focused on was motive, but not in the traditional sense. Not jealousy, not money, not rage. Control, loss of control. And the moment that loss became undeniable. According to legal analysts following the case, this was a deliberate choice. Control-based violence cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute because they don't rely on explosive moments. They rely on slow erosion, on dynamics that jurors may recognize uncomfortably. So prosecutors made a strategic decision. They would walk the jury through the emotional timeline before they ever showed them a single piece of physical evidence. They wanted jurors to feel the tension before they saw the outcome, because tension explains escalation, and escalation explains intent. One of the most pivotal prosecutorial decisions was how to frame the relationship dynamics. They avoided sensational language. No dramatic accusations, no emotionally charged speculation. Instead, they used behavioral facts, patterns of access, patterns of resistance, patterns of reaction. They showed how boundaries tightened, how responses changed, how silence replaced negotiation, and how, at each stage, the reaction to that tightening grew more intense. This wasn't about a momentary lapse. This was about an inability to tolerate loss. Prosecutors then turned to something juries understand intuitively: choices. Because intent is built from choices. And in the final weeks, there were choices everywhere. Choices to respect boundaries or push against them. Choices to seek help or isolate. Choices to disengage or escalate. And prosecutors argue that at every critical junction, the same choice was made. Push. That consistency matters. Because consistency is the backbone of intent. Now here's where the case sharpened dramatically. Prosecutors introduced the concept of foreseeability. The idea that outcomes don't need to be planned in detail to be intentional. They only need to be foreseeable. And according to their argument, this outcome was because when someone repeatedly tests boundaries and repeatedly reacts poorly to resistance and increasingly interprets autonomy as betrayal, escalation is not a surprise. It's a pattern. To support that argument, prosecutors leaned heavily on expert testimony. Behavioral specialists explained how grievance accumulation works, how entitlement erodes empathy, how emotional detachment precedes action, and most importantly, how the final calm is often mistaken for resolution. They explained that this calm isn't peace, it's decision. And once jurors understand that distinction, the entire case looks different. The defense, of course, anticipated this strategy. They countered with the argument of stress, pressure, mental health struggles. They framed the incident as a tragic breakdown, an explosion under unbearable circumstances. But prosecutors were ready, because breakdowns look chaotic. This didn't. Breakdowns involve confusion. This didn't. Breakdowns leave behind impulsivity. This left behind sequence. And sequence implies choice. Prosecutors emphasized this again and again. They showed how actions followed a logical progression, how there was time to pause, time to stop, time to choose differently, and how those opportunities were passed over. That's not accident. That's intent. Now let's talk about the moment the narrative truly shifted. It happened during a closed-door evidentiary review, a moment legal analysts later described as the point of no return. Because during that review, prosecutors laid out the timeline not by clock time, but by decision points. Point 1, resistance appears. Point 2, control challenged. Point 3, emotional withdrawal. Point 4, fixation intensifies. Point 5, silence. Point 6, action. When viewed that way, the story stops looking like a sudden tragedy. It looks like a progression. And progressions carry responsibility. This reframing had a profound effect on everyone involved. Investigators, attorneys, even family members who had initially struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the outcome. Because reframing doesn't just change legal arguments. It changes emotional understanding. It answers the question that haunts survivors the most. How did this happen? The answer, according to prosecutors, wasn't all at once. It was step by step. And once that became clear, another shift occurred. The language in the case hardened. Charges were no longer described cautiously. They were stated plainly. Because caution had been exhausted, prosecutors were no longer trying to avoid discomfort. They were leaning into truth. And that truth was uncomfortable, especially for anyone who had ever ignored a warning sign. Now here's the part of the case that made seasoned attorneys pause. Prosecutors didn't just argue that the outcome was foreseeable. They argued that it had been silently anticipated. Not by everyone, but by someone. The family member who warned authorities immediately. That warning wasn't emotional. It was specific, urgent, and prosecutors believe that statement will play a pivotal role because it demonstrates awareness, not hindsight. Awareness before the outcome. That changes everything. Because when someone anticipates danger and communicates it, the danger wasn't hidden. It was visible. And visibility creates accountability. This is where the case moves beyond legal theory and into moral reckoning. Because it forces a question no one likes to ask. If someone saw this coming, why didn't more people? Why wasn't intervention earlier? Why was fear allowed to coexist with denial? Prosecutors aren't accusing the family of failure, but they are highlighting a system that repeatedly teaches people to minimize discomfort, to preserve peace, to avoid confrontation. And that system, they argue, creates space for escalation. As the case moved toward trial, the courtroom strategy became clear. This wouldn't be a case argued through shock. It would be argued through understanding, through education, through walking jurors step by step into the mindset that made this outcome possible. And that approach is risky, because it asks jurors to reflect on their own lives, their own silences, their own rationalizations. But prosecutors believe that discomfort is necessary, because without it, patterns repeat. Now, as the legal process accelerates, the weight of what's coming next becomes impossible to ignore. Witness lists grow, expert testimony expands, and the family prepares to relive everything publicly. Not just the night, but the years. And that is often the hardest part. Because public accountability doesn't just expose actions, it exposes dynamics, choices, silences, and the consequences of all three. As we move into the next chapter, the focus shifts again, from prosecution strategy to impact, how this case has rippled outward, how it's changed conversations, and how those closest to the story are grappling with what can never be undone. Because beyond the courtroom, there are lives that will never return to what they were. And understanding that cost is essential, because justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about reckoning. And reckoning has a price. What happens after the truth starts coming out? Not the verdict, not the headlines, but the quiet moments afterward, when people realize nothing will ever go back to the way it was. Because once this case shifted from a private tragedy to a public reckoning, the impact didn't stay contained within court filings and sealed evidence rooms. It spread. Through the family, through the investigation, and through every conversation that followed. And that ripple effect may be the most enduring part of this story. For the family, the damage wasn't limited to grief. It was fragmentation. Relationships strained under the weight of hindsight. Every memory re-examined. Every interaction replayed. Suddenly, moments that once felt insignificant took on unbearable meaning. That dinner where tension lingered. That canceled visit. That awkward silence no one addressed. All of it became evidence, not in court, but in the mind. And that kind of evidence never rests. Family members reportedly began asking the same questions over and over. How did we miss this? What should we have done differently? Was there a moment we could have changed the outcome? Those questions don't come with answers. They come with guilt. And guilt, when mixed with grief, can fracture even the strongest bonds. Some relatives withdrew completely. Others became consumed with understanding every detail. Two coping strategies, both painful, and both common in cases like this. Investigators noticed this fracture early. It showed up in interviews, in tone, in how people spoke about the same events differently. Because trauma doesn't unify, it individualizes. Each person carries their own version of the truth, and those versions don't always align. One of the most striking changes came in how family members spoke about the past. Language shifted. What was once described as difficult became concerning. What was once complicated became dangerous. That evolution didn't happen overnight. It happened as evidence accumulated, as patterns became undeniable, and as denial became unsustainable. That transition is brutal, because it requires accepting that love and danger coexisted in the same space. And that realization shatters simplistic narratives. For investigators, the ripple effect was professional as much as emotional. This case began showing up in internal discussions, training sessions, briefings, not because of who the family was, but because of what the case demonstrated. How control-based dynamics can hide in plain sight. How warning signs don't always scream. They whisper. And how easily those whispers can be ignored when they're inconvenient. Several investigators later acknowledged something uncomfortable. If this family had been less private, if the dynamics had played out more publicly, intervention might have come sooner. But privacy, while often protective, can also be isolating. And isolation breeds unchecked behavior. This realization prompted internal reviews, not public ones, quiet ones, re-examinations of how cases involving family dynamics are evaluated. How much weight is given to gut feelings? How seriously discomfort is treated when there's no visible violence? Because this case forced a reckoning, not just about crime, but about prevention. And prevention requires listening before it's urgent. Now let's talk about the broader conversation this case ignited. Because once details began circulating, carefully, responsibly, something shifted. People started talking, not about this family, about their own, about moments they'd brushed off, behaviors they'd rationalized, discomfort they'd minimized because it felt easier than confronting it. Online forums, support groups, private conversations, all started echoing the same theme. I thought it was just awkward. I didn't want to overreact. I didn't think it could turn into something serious. Those phrases show up everywhere after cases like this. Because hindsight strips away ambiguity. But foresight requires courage. And courage is often what's missing. Mental health professionals began referencing the case, not by name, but by pattern. They used it to illustrate how entitlement can masquerade as dependency, how control can wear the mask of closeness, and how silence, while often well-intentioned, can become an accomplice. One therapist involved in a similar case described it this way. The danger isn't always the behavior itself. It's the system of excuses built around it. That system was on full display here. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but effectively. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because it means this isn't rare. It's common. It just doesn't always end this way. But when it does, the cost is irreversible. The legal system felt the ripple effect too. Prosecutors across jurisdictions quietly began discussing the case. Not the details, the framework, the approach to intent, the emphasis on patterns rather than moments. And that approach is already influencing how similar cases are being built. Less focus on the explosion, more focus on the fuse. That shift matters. Because fuses are where prevention lives. Once an explosion happens, options disappear. But fuses can be cut. If someone notices them, if someone acts, if someone speaks up early enough. Now let's return to the family, because the ripple doesn't end with understanding. It ends with living. Living with consequences that no amount of explanation can soften. Birthdays that feel wrong. Holidays that feel empty. Rooms that will never feel the same. And perhaps most painful of all, memories that no longer feel safe to revisit. Some family members reportedly struggle with anger, not just toward one person, but toward the past, toward the version of themselves that didn't see what they now believe was obvious. That kind of anger is corrosive, because it has nowhere to go. Others cling to compassion, not as forgiveness, but as survival, because carrying hatred alongside grief is unbearable. Neither path is easy. Both are attempts to cope with an outcome no one wanted. And then there's the person who spoke up, the one who warned authorities immediately. Their experience is uniquely heavy, because speaking the truth didn't bring relief. It brought confirmation of a fear they never wanted validated. And that confirmation carries its own trauma. Because once you know your fear was justified, you can never unknow it. Investigators have acknowledged how critical that warning was, not just legally, but morally. It shattered denial. It forced urgency. And it may have prevented further harm. That matters.